Okay, the last bit of plumbing to do is figure out how to do the heater hoses. Now these two hoses go over to the water pump and the intake manifold, and then there's the two fittings for the heater, and somehow I got to make this three-way valve fit. I've got a couple pieces of elbow fittings, plus these are 3/4 inch hoses. These are 5/8 hoses. These are 5/8. So I've got reducers. Plus I have to make sure the cable's going to work wherever this gets fitted up. So it's, you know, these two lower fittings go to the intake in the water pump, and the upper two up here go to the heater. So I don't know. I mean, it's not a lot of real estate. There's a lot of tight turns that's going to have to be made. You know, if I flip it this way, but then I also have to be able to make the turns. I can flip it this way, but then I got to get from there up to the heater tubes. Plus I got the AC lines in the way. So it would have been, you know, sometimes it's easier if these fittings are on the inside, but this aftermarket unit is stuck right through the firewalls, which makes it nice. But on the other hand, if you're going to do a complex setup like this, it would have been nicer to put the valve inside, and then all you'd have to do is have the two hoses go through from the engine into the passenger compartment. So that's the last bit of plumbing. Everything else is roughed in, terminated, fittings are all done. So I'm pretty close to being able to bolt the body down, but I still have to do the steering setup. So we'll just keep going. So the battery's going to go right here. I already have the holes drilled for the wires to come through the floor, but there's quite a step here, so I'll put the battery box. And of course you got to make sure you can actually get the battery out, so it can't be like way up here. It'd be kind of a pain, so I'm going to keep it, you know, out a little bit. But then, you know, now I got a big gap here, so I'll have to make up some kind of bracket to bridge that gap. So I got the battery mounted. I made a bracket to bolt to the bottom of the floor pan. I just got to put a fuse in. I think it's going to go like right here, and the cables can come up. Positive will go to the fuse, and then the negative can go all the way into the negative side of the battery. So, but I can't terminate the ends yet until I have the body down permanent, and I still got to lift it up and down for a few things, but it's pretty solid, rigid. It's not going anywhere. And I got the cover for it. I got to put a vent. It gets vented through the floor pan. So getting a step closer. Got the steering column installed. So now I'm trying to figure out the U-joints we're going to need. I've got a couple of parts here. I got a bearing, some extra shaft. So I'm not sure how it's going to work, but it looks like I might be able to just run a piece from, I mean, it's pretty tight, but I might be able to make it with just one shaft there. It looks like the angles might line up pretty good, but with a third joint in line, you're gonna have to have the bearing to keep the shafts from flopping around, which is going to be kind of difficult to mount somewhere in there. And then I don't know, the joints I have here, these are larger shafts, which won't fit in that bearing. So I'd have to use that shaft down there. That joint down on the steering rack, I didn't put that together, but I think it's probably one of those triangle shaped ones for a typical Ford U-joint. So, and again, that shaft, this shaft in here isn't really the actual shaft. It's kind of just a mock-up piece, just to see if I can get the angles right. But there's no way without this U-joint, you know, it's never gonna make it. And it would have to be like up through the exhaust manifold to get a clear shot to this U-joint. So it's gonna need a third joint, but I'll mock up a couple pieces and test it out first. Other than that, it's going along pretty good. Pretty pleased with how it's going. I'll just keep at it. So I need to mount this bearing to the frame, and it's just really difficult to try to hold this, measure this with a tape measure for a piece of metal. I want it to be welded to the frame here and then to this bracket here. I'm also going to probably put a gusset on this motor mount. I didn't make those. I think they need a little more strength. So with the arc droid, when you're making a template or making a sketch, I found it's easier to just start at one corner and measure over for everything. So now I can go to the screen and just draw a rectangle, and based on these dimensions, 1.5 inches tall, 2.5 inches long, and then for the circle, for the hole, 1 3/8 inches over, 1 inch up, and a 3/4 inch hole, and I can put that in on the arc droid pretty quick and cut a piece out. Got the steering shafts mocked up. The bearing is put in place. I found a couple nuts locally, which I was shocked because they were 3/4 inch 16 thread. But it's put in place just temporarily, just to check it, and everything turns. There's no binding. There's no tight spots, it seems. So I think that's going to work out pretty good. You see the joint down in there. I gotta finish welding it to the frame, but I think that's going to work out pretty good. I mean, the body's not bolted down permanent yet, but there's lots of adjustment in the shafts, so I think I'll wait until the body's 100% bolted down before I mark and drill the shafts, and then should be in good shape. Okay, I got the heater hoses routed, so they come out of the firewall here, and then I'm going to send them back through the firewall to the 3-way valve, and then from the engine, here's the return line to the pump. I took the metal tube off. It just looked goofy. It was all bent up in the wrong directions, and there really wasn't any purpose. So this actually worked out okay. And it gives me a little more room behind the engine. So and I have a clamp back there. I mean, it would be really difficult to work on, but you know, if it's going to look good, sometimes you got to tear stuff apart to get to things. So then the intake, I've got an adapter piece that's 3/4 by 5/8 elbow that I found. Now it's going to be tricky, but this will actually slide right through the grommet in there. And then so the water valve can be on the other side of the firewall. It's not gonna be fun to work on, but hopefully doesn't leak. And I'll test everything really well before buttoning up the dash and everything anyway. I mean, you can get to it, but you just have to take some stuff apart. Since we're not using the EGR valve system, there's a port on the exhaust manifold that's got to be plugged. So what I do is I take the fitting that goes in there, cut off the threads, and weld it up. That's the piece that threads into the exhaust manifold. This is the fitting that is screwed onto the pipe for the EGR, so just cut that off. And I'll put like a big bolt in there, cut it off flush, and weld it up. There it is, all welded up, smoothed off a little bit. I'll put a little bit of paint on it, keep it from rusting, high temperature header paint, and then I'll plug off the EGR port. I hooked up a sprayer and pressurized it, and it's got some oil in it, and hooked it to the oil pressure port on the motor. And so I'm priming the drivetrain. You can see the oil starting to come out up here and leaking down. So that's the best way to prime these motors, because there's no distributor hole like the old school engines did. So this way here, you know you got oil going to everything before you actually start it, so you don't start it dry. This one's been sitting for a long time without any oil in it. Yeah, we're getting some pretty good flow now. So that's really all you need to do. I don't see any coming out up here though. Oh, so yep, it's dripping over here. So that's good. Alright, so I can button it back up now and fill it with the rest of the oil. After priming the engine with the oil, I'm going to put the valve covers back on. But on the mod motors, there's a front cover that has a seam that you do need a little bit of RTV on. Even though the gaskets are reusable, you still want to put a little bit right there, because otherwise, where the case, two pieces come together, you can get an oil leak. A little bit of a setback today. The injectors that are going to actually be installed are a little different than the factory injectors that were on the motor. So these are a little taller, the old ones are. So the new ones, which would be these, are quite a bit shorter. So I had already made custom brackets to mount the fuel rails. So I just cut them all apart now, and I'm going to have to make, because they're substantially lower than they were before. So not a big deal. A few minutes of cutting and welding and grinding, and I'll paint them up again, and it'll be fine. Because I actually got this lower intake is on for good, set in place. I got the wires run through the firewall and draped out, ready to get routed around to everything. Got the coils installed. I got the valve covers on, obviously. I primed the engine. I got some oil down in the cylinders. So I shouldn't have to take this stuff apart again, but you never know. So a little setback, but not a big deal. And I'll have that buttoned up, and then I can start finishing up the wiring and get the supercharger installed. I got a vacuum line here that's going to run around back inside for the map sensor, because this doesn't have a mass air sensor. It's strictly by manifold air pressure. So I'll get these wires run, and I think we should be in pretty good shape. Little change in plans. I had to reroute the fuel lines. The fuel regulator was just really just too crowded on the back of the motor back here. So in order to clear everything, it was almost sticking up above the edge of the firewall here. So I just mounted it further over. It's actually a little cleaner as far as getting to the fittings and access. You know, this will all get tied up a little cleaner, but everything's routed. You can still get to everything pretty well. It's tight, but it's got a lot of controls, a lot of wires, a lot of hoses, but actually gets, you know, cleans up. The main thing was this heater hose is coming back in here because that was a little bit of a change to help get that valve out of there and get it into the engine, into the passenger compartment. So I think the lines are all done. Some of the wires are hooked up, the injectors, coils. I gotta route like the alternator wire, oil, and then, you know, a bunch of these sensor wires need to be connected here, and they need to be hooked up. But the really hard part is kind of closing in on that, so I'd like to at least bump it over and fire it. So, but you still got to program the computer for the injector size, the throttle body, the map sensor. I think that might be for the coolant temperature, because I've got the intake air temperature here. Got the oil pressure, fuel pressure will read right off the regulator. Throttle body's got the throttle position, and then the actual actuator from the throttle on it. So the vacuum port is already run from here inside to the map sensor. I got to put a T in it to come over to do the boost reference on the pressure regulator. So a couple more things, then I can bolt the blower on. I got a gas cap. I already got the gas cap today. Oh, I do need one more fitting over here, because now, since I'm not coming in both sides for the regulator, I'm just going to put a plug, but that'll be here in a couple days. So all in all, it's starting to come together. All right, looking good. Getting closer now. The supercharger's bolted on. All the fuel lines are hooked up. I had to relocate the regulator over to here. There just was not enough room. It was too congested, and things were on interfering with each other. I still need to get a PCV connector for the valve cover. That seems to be missing. The belt's on. I'm waiting for the dry belt for the alternator. The harnesses are all plugged in. All the vacuum lines are run for the map sensor. The boost reference for the pressure regulator. I got the ones that aren't being used because there's no tank ventilation system, you know, like the original manufacturer, so those got plugged off. Still got some wiring to do, but all the, I think I have most of the main wires run for the battery cables, because the battery's in the trunk and it goes all the way up to the alternator. That's connected up. Starting motor's connected up. Gonna do it a little differently though. Put a relay remote mounted, so the main battery cable along the frame is not energized unless you start it. So there's a starter relay here that energizes the cable on the frame, and then after it starts and you go back to the run position, that will de-energize, and so the cable will be unpowered on the frame. Holly requires you hook it right directly to the battery, which I did, and I've put the mega fuses in. So there's one wire for that goes directly to the alternator, and the other wire will go up to the console for the kill switch, cutoff switch, and that'll it's mainly a theft prevention thing. So that'll feed all the other power. So getting closer. So with the starter relay back in the trunk connected to the battery, and then the battery cable that runs along the frame right to the starter, I have a theory that I can just jumper that main power that comes from the main battery cable through that solenoid right to the terminal on the starter. So in theory, when the main battery cable is energized by the relay in the trunk, the power from that will energize this solenoid and kick the starter over. So I think it'll work, so I'll give it a try. So I'm going to just test it out quick. I just want to bump it. I want to make sure the starter motor turns the motor and that there's no weird electrical feedback or anything. So it starts the motor, it turns it over. So I don't want to get crazy, nothing's really ready to start, but I want to make sure the electrical was working properly before I get too far. So now I can move on with some of the other systems like the fuel pump and things like that. So I jumpered out the fuel pump relay so it'll just stay on. The computer's not running. But this way here I can adjust the static pressure to 42 pounds. All I did was jumper, put a little piece of wire across the relay to jump it. I put about 5 gallons of gas in. Making sure everything's working. And then this way here I can check for any leaks. Make sure there's no issues. So far so good. I don't see anything, but I'll lift it up, make sure all the fittings are dry. Okay, it powered up, so no smoke. That's good news. I know it looks pretty nasty, but all the fuses are pulled out of the main breaker, so nothing's going to really short out. The only thing hooked up is the Holly and everything to make the motor run. But I got it connected to the throttle. It's all drive-by wire, so that's pretty cool. I haven't noticed any gas leaks. It primes the fuel pump like it's supposed to for a couple seconds when you turn it on, and it's holding fuel pressure. So it's getting pretty close. I got a belt on. I got to get a different size belt because this one I couldn't get around the idler for some reason. It must be a little bit too short. I don't know if it's different. What's going on there? I've been trying to feed some transmission fluid in it. Slow. I got about 5 quarts in it. But I'm going to have to go around and make sure there's no wires touching the exhaust. I just want to test fire it and make sure that it will run. I got some adjustments to make on the computer program. I got to make sure I have the right map sensor and injectors. I just put something in there for now just to make sure everything would fire up and work, or at least turn on. So getting pretty close to starting it.